The interesting thing about a lot of things is that almost none of those things are unifaceted, meaning that there are many, in the case that I'm about to present, there are many reasons for the motivation or the procedure of various different endeavors. And one of them that I'm specifically addressing has to do with the study of metaphysics, and specifically the field that I've been most interested in for over 20 years, which is metaphysical sciences. And the thing about what I've learned about metaphysical sciences in general, just metaphysics, a lot of, especially the modern metaphysics, which would really fall under the categories of New Age, New Thought, those type of things. And they're really synonymous in a lot of ways with paranormal and supernatural studies. And the truth that I've had to come face to face with is that most of it is bullshit. Most of the things that people will attempt to pass off to you as being part of our reality, at least on this earth, in this plane, in this specific in this specific permutation, right, or version of reality, most of it is nonsense. And if it's not, then whatever alien overlords are overseeing the running of, or the operations of what we perceive as reality are very, very clever, or just very powerful. You know, I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about several times how we are, 1% evolved in a certain upward direction of intelligence, what we call intelligence, from chimpanzees. And that to us, they're basically like children in some ways, even though there's, they have sophisticated hierarchies and things like that. But with, what we consider and what we measure as intelligence and certain forms of communication and things like that, they are infinitely primitive. I mean, they cannot communicate to us certain things in the way that we can communicate to each other. And so in that way, I'm thinking that if we do have some alien overlords, right, which this talk is not about that. This monologue is not about whether or not we have alien overlords. But I'm just making an example of that. If there were, they are to the point of that 1%. If they would only need be 1% more advanced genetically in the same degree that we are to the chimps, in order to completely dwarf us in technological prowess, and for us to maybe not be able to detect their presence and know that we are part of an alien ant farm. So it is an interesting thing to think about. So, but really, metaphysics, beyond the physical or beyond in nature, which when you really break down the words, it seems kind of odd to say that thing. I mean, what really goes beyond nature? Unless we reclassify nature as being, once again, as I was noting earlier, the very specific rendition or version or permutation of what we call reality, right? Then maybe we can talk about going beyond this nature, because that's what physics is actually. Physics comes from the ancient Greek physica, meaning nature, and meta means above or beyond. So metaphysics is beyond nature. But is that really appropriate to say, unless we phrase it in the context that I just did, about that this is a specific rendition here and there very well may be things beyond. And I suppose I'm not really arguing for or necessarily against what we might call metaphysics, or at least the way that I've identified it. Because on a tangent here I can go and say that for example, there's a very wonderful niche in theoretical physics called string theory. And I first learned about string theory back in 2004, as far as I can tell. It was my first contact with string theory. And it was because of a good friend, Kevin, who let me live with him at a time when my girlfriend dumped me and I had to move out of our Hollywood Hills apartment. And I moved in with him, and he was, and is probably still, I mean, he is, well, first of all, one thing, he is one of the co-hosts of a great YouTube live stream called The Real Short Box. But he is a person who's very much interested in media. I know he had a major and a minor. I know one of them was in communications in the film school, and I think he had a minor in film history. But he's just really a lover of multimedia. And so one of the things he would do is would buy and or rent various different documentaries and things of all kinds. Like he had all kinds of sets of unsolved mysteries. I remember one time he had me binge watch every single episode of the TV show, the original Star Trek, because the J.J. Abrams and the more recent movie came out, and I was really into it. And then when I watched it, I realized how much they paid homage actually to it, which was really cool. But my point is that he one of the things that he introduced me to in string theory was a PBS had a show called, it was like Nova, I think that was their science division, and there was I don't know, what would you call that, but I'll just say it was a video presentation, and Kevin brought it on DVD, and it was of The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene, who that's his specialty is string theory. And Brian Greene, it was based on his book. So I got wind of that in 2004. I think that the Nova PBS special came out in 2003, and Brian Greene, the theoretical physicist, published the book by the same name, The Elegant Universe, in 1998. And so in this theory, basically it proposes to unite classical physics, specifically Einstein's general relativity, dealing with gravity and the warping of space-time, that kind of thing, and to reconcile it with quantum mechanics, which basically there are three other laws that follow quantum mechanical rules and use quanta. For example, electromagnetism, the mediator, the gauge bosons that transmit the electromagnetic force, right, in the whole electromagnetic spectrum are photons, and virtual photons being, exchanged back and forth. And then you have other ones that are similar that I think that even in that documentary, if I remember correctly, they were called the brothers of the photon, and they were called gluons. And the gluons were responsible for the strong force. And there's also something related called the strong nuclear force. So there's a little bit of a delineation, but they're basically the same thing. We can call them the strong nuclear force. And then there is radiation that we detect with the weak nuclear force. And all of those can be measured and detected and calculated and discussed in terms of quantum mechanics, whereas gravity is dealt with in Einsteinian mechanics, specifically the general relativity, which was, the next best thing that came after Isaac Newton dealing with his laws of motion. And I'm going into all of that, one, just because I like to geek out about it. Sometimes speaking about it helps me to recall it, and some people may not know about it. And I've been told that a lot of stuff that I talk about is, I need to kind of simplify it more. So I'm attempting to do that. But also because the string theory, there was a gentleman, a physicist named Sheldon Glashow that was featured in the documentary, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he basically said something like that at the distances and energies at which these strings are mathematically, supposed to exist, we don't have the current technology to right now or to ever perceive that we'll ever be able to detect directly these strings, except mathematically, right? Basically, and he says so the theory is safe. He's talking about string theory, permanently safe. And he says, now, is that a theory of physics or a philosophy? I ask you. And that is interesting because string theory, they use the word elegant a lot with it. I mean, the book is called The Elegant Universe because it's internally consistent. The mathematics adds up all across. It links up quantum mechanics with general relativity mathematically. And, quantum mechanics is, one of the most successful sciences on the planet. And people like Richard Feynman, who, I've read a couple of his books, the 6 Easy Pieces. He's got another one called 6 Not So Easy Pieces, which definitely was that. I didn't really get to finish those. And his book, QED, Quantum Electrodynamics, another really super successful theory, meaning it has a lot of testable predictions that have been verified. And this is with quantum mechanics, and we're using it all the time when we're making quantum computers and all this stuff. But with string theory, as elegant as it is, and as much as it says that it can reconcile general relativity, with quantum mechanics, there's no way to prove it. It's permanently safe, although it's mathematically consistent. And I find that fascinating. And it's one of the reasons, which is what I started off with this, originally saying that there are a lot of things that have the feature that there are various different reasons for a certain path to be taken. And it is exactly this, and what's related to string theory and the elegant universe, of one of the reasons, not the only, why I took 16 years to finish a PhD to become a philosopher of metaphysical sciences from the University of Metaphysical Sciences, which I enrolled officially in 2008 and started getting my materials for it, and for various other reasons, but specifically the one that I'm talking about here, it took me that long because, as I opened up with as well, that most of the subject in metaphysical sciences and as fascinating as they are, many of them, and some of the stuff that I studied at the University of Metaphysical Sciences, which I'm grateful for because it was a wonderful journey, and I learned a lot of amazing, interesting things about what people believe. There were over 80 courses that I took and various different essays to write and meditations to do and all that. But again, I say that in reality, most of it is bullshit, and it should be relegated to fantasy and science fiction. It's good for that. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the stuff that you would see in what I realized, and I don't know if a lot of people know this. It's possible that they do, because I'm not the first to know everything. A lot of things go straight over my head. But I noticed that, for example, just watching things from the Marvel Cinematic Universe are things that you learn about in metaphysical sciences. Like a lot of the powers that they have and the things they do, and these things are all from myths and legends and superstitions and religions and all kinds of supernatural, paranormal, and metaphysical teachings in these mystery schools and all that. And watching The Elegant Universe, very shortly after that, I came across What the Bleep Do We Know, which mixed a lot of physics with a lot of the quantum woo-woo and new agey type of stuff. And then by the time I graduated from the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, this was in 2004, and all of this is in the beginning of my PhD thesis, which is called Eternal Echoes, Metaphysical Inquiry into the Fate of the Universe. And I also published it as a book on Amazon in my own bookstore called All That Blooms Must Die, Eternal Echoes of the Universe. And so, but I saw all these things, and they were all, it's interesting because you have The Elegant Universe, which is all, theoretical physics, string theory. And then What the Bleep Do We Know, which was like an interesting hybrid of that and woo-woo. And then you have The Secret, which I saw last, which was all the woo-woo stuff. And then while being a student at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, it was all hands-on and very clinical, and it was basically just proving to me over and over again that hypnosis actually works. 20 days after I enrolled in the school on November 4th of 2004, I was at a Thanksgiving dinner sleepover thing, and the next morning I hypnotized a young woman who was a friend of one of the other ladies who was hosting the party, and she went into a very deep trance state and basically followed all of the suggestions that I gave and came out of the trance when I suggested it, when I counted her out. And it was proof of the concept. It was proof that this actually worked, that it was real. And of course, we were doing practicums all the time in school, but for some reason, all of that combined with, those things that I was watching in these videos and the things that I was learning, I had to step back. Like I was taking classes and doing things, but as the time came closer to get the bachelor's degree, I just started thinking to myself, I don't know if I can do this just based off the stuff that's in the curriculum, and then when I would start to approach the PhD, I started thinking to myself, I don't know if I want to really, if I can base my thesis on any of the stuff that comes from here, because I don't believe in it. I don't feel good about it. That thing that people talk about, imposter syndrome, I was really insecure about it. I didn't think that there was anything in the curriculum, except they had yoga and they had hypnosis courses, right? And I have a degree in clinical hypnosis from HMI, hypnosis.edu. You can check them out. They're nationally accredited, the first nationally accredited college of hypnosis, recognized by the Department of Education. I say that because a lot of people don't know about how really legit that hypnosis is not a belief system. It's a behavioral science that works on people's belief systems. We consider ourselves to be belief system enhancers who help people achieve the results that they desire through incremental change under the scope of practice being vocational and avocational motivation and self-improvement, and it certainly helps a lot of people. It's helped me, but it's not in the same category of a lot of the woo-woo stuff, although even at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute we learned some woo-woo stuff. I had a teacher and I had experiences with my clinical residency. Some of my most fascinating clients, I did past life regression with them, and it was really incredible experiences. And I mean, they had Reiki classes there, and some other stuff. I don't remember exactly, but those are two things that I remember that were pretty kind of woo-woo, was past life regression and Reiki. And I'm not dismissing them and saying that they don't work or that there's not something to them, just that they kind of do fit into that category of a lot of the metaphysical types of stuff. And so I couldn't proceed with a clear conscience to write things about that. So as a matter of fact, the first paper that I wrote was one of the bachelor's creative projects that I elected to do. I wrote it about astrology and numerology and how they might actually be affected by the distance, of the Earth from the Sun, aphelion, perihelion, right? Ap being away, perihelion being closer, and the tilt of the axis of the Earth and how it spins, and basically its relationship to the Sun and what season people were born in, and maybe those things had to do. And I talked about seasonal affective disorder, and so I really brought neurology, sleep science, and geophysics and a little bit of astrophysics into the discussion of astrology and numerology, but mainly astrology, and talked about the signs and things like that. And that's what I felt more comfortable doing. I was like, okay, I'm going to write this about metaphysics, but I need to do it this way. And then when I did the master's project, I wrote about a demon named Nurgle, because I had a weird dream about it, which was weird because, to my knowledge, I'd never heard about Nurgle before the dream. And then sometime later I got a book that was called the Dictionary of Angels or something like that, and as I was thumbing through it, I found Nurgle inside there, and it was kind of surprising. So maybe I did have some contact with it before reading something, but I don't recall. Wow, there are a lot of foxes. Almost every single night that I've been driving around at night going home, there are foxes running across the road. I didn't realize how small they were. Foxes are small animals. They're not much bigger than cats. They're like between the size of the average cat and the average dog. They're not really big creatures. So, and then when it came time to do the doctorate, I had already long before that, even before I did the bachelor's and even before I did the master's, I had long decided that I was going to hijack the degree, meaning that I was going to write as scientific and as empirical a thesis as I possibly could, while keeping it close to the heart of metaphysics, which I learned is basically it's a branch of philosophy, of course, because even the name metaphysics comes from an ancient biographer of Aristotle, his books, the Physics, which were things that change, and metaphysics are the things that do not change. And the underlying foundation of reality is what metaphysics is supposed to really talk about, and consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality. And so then I realized that that Socrates, one of the most interesting Greek philosophers to me, who had to swallow poison hemlock because of his questions. They said he was corrupting the youth and all this other stuff like that. And there was a PhD student at MIT who was actually getting a degree in philosophy, And she said that the way that I asked questions a lot was a lot like Socrates. And she says, or from at least, well, I mean, it's not like either one of us had, like, we know Socrates or anything like that, but she says from what she knows, that it seemed that the way that I inquire about things and question things in general, she says that I just have an inquisitive nature. And she said, I could see how that could probably rub a lot of people the wrong way, because you just ask and she says, I don't want to say you ask too many questions, but for some people, they might say that you ask too many questions because they just don't like it. And so I basically wrote my paper in a very Socratic way. Everything had a question. I determined that I was going to state various different facts from cosmology, which cosmology is the science that we hear a lot. We don't necessarily always use that term, a lot of people, because mostly it seems like it would generally be categorized, if people weren't using the terminology, they would say, oh, that's space science, right? So as astronomy, astrophysics, right? Because often things that are talked about in cosmology, I mean, that technically was kind of the field that Einstein was in when we're talking about gravity and space-time, right? Because it all has to do, it's related to things having to do with how did the universe start? Like, what's the origin of the universe? The Big Bang, right? And when we think about the Big Bang, then we think about black holes and stars and planets and all that stuff, right? Which is astrophysics, but the questions about where all those things came from in space, and then finally getting down into the planets themselves, right, before we get to life and everything like that. But where did all that come from is generally under the category of cosmology. So that's basically how I went about with my thesis. Was I just decided, okay, what I'm going to do is write my paper on the intersection of cosmology and metaphysics. And really, when you get down to it, that's not really a far stretch at all. It was actually quite convenient. It was actually one of the more appropriate things to do. It was actually probably one of the best things I could have done in order to draw that bridge between the two seemingly disparate or different fields of study. But they're very closely related, because metaphysics is asking the questions about what is the fundamental nature of our reality, and cosmology is basically asking the same question, but from a more physics standpoint, like how did it all start, and how can we test and measure that, and things like cosmic background radiation and the different forces, the fundamental forces, and so that's one of the reasons why I took so long to finish my degrees in metaphysical sciences, because I actually didn't. It wasn't until 2020. My wife passed away in 2019 in October, and then sometime in 2020, I finished the. Actually, was it 2020 or 2022? I know I published a couple books in China in 2020. So no, maybe it was 2022. I don't remember now. But it could have, was it? I don't know. I have to check. But either 2022, let's just say it's 2022. I first got the bachelor's, which, is already pushing it, because that's that's already 16 years after, or what am I saying here? No, 14 years after, 2008. And then in 2024, 16 years, that's the master's degree. Wait a minute. No. Yeah, it was 2020. 2020 was the bachelor's degree. 2022 was the master's. And then 2024, wow, it's 2026 already. That's crazy. 2024 was when I finally finished the PhD, which is 16 years later. Okay, right, that timeline's correct. So it was 2020. And so yeah, it took that time, but it was because I was suffering from a bit of insecurity about it and what people will call imposter syndrome. And I didn't want to publish something and have a doctorate attached to my name, regardless of whether the school is recognized by the Department of Education currently, unlike like the Hypnosis Motivation Institute is. If you're a psychologist, a nurse, a medical doctor, and you need continuing education credits, you can actually go to the Hypnosis Motivation Institute and get those continuing education units and from some of the various subjects that they teach at that school. Whereas that's not the same that can be said for the University of Metaphysical Sciences. It lies outside of the mainstream school system. Now it's recognized, it's legally operating, it has, tax exempt status. It's the church that I was ordained as a minister through is the church that's directly connected to the school. Wisdom of the Heart Church, both founded by Christine Breese, and back in 2004, I believe. So the school's been around for about 22 years now. And so, but it's like one of those mystery schools I was talking about. Technically, it's like the cult of Pythagoras, right? And these numerologists back then who had these mystery schools that were studying numbers and stuff like that. The University of Metaphysical Sciences is a modern day version of that, but it has much broader subject matter. I mean, it goes really deep, and there's a lot of fascinating things that you can learn from them. And so all of that, from string theory to from the elegant universe, what I learned from there, from what the bleep do we know, and from the secret, and all that stuff swimming around in my head, and really wanting to reconcile, and that's one of the reasons why, because I felt like I started to formulate something also where I made an acronym out of META, M-E-T-A, which is mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics, in which I proposed that because of the fact that mainstream science has so many fascinating things that are seemingly bizarre and just mind-blowing, if I may say so, that like things, for example, like superposition, like quantum superposition and quantum entanglement, Einstein called spooky action at a distance, and these, the fact that, and then also other things that are spoken about in mainstream physics, like the many worlds hypothesis and the multiverse, and and virtual particles, even, for example. Just there's so many things, and when you look into quantum field theory and 0-point energy, and so there's enough stuff that's way out there in physics that when people on the side who would be metaphysics and say that a lot of scientists may be closed-minded and they're not being open, they're being too rigid, too conservative, and they really don't know what more there is out there, and that's why there's a need for metaphysics and stuff like that. I say, well, have you really looked at what's going on in the physics books? Because they have some pretty far out there stuff. So my acronym was a way of me saying, look, you should at least have a fundamental foundation in mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics, META physics, before you start trying to say where physics ends and where metaphysics begins. And I don't have a super deep understanding of any of these subjects. I'm more of a person who can talk about them conceptually and create a lot of analogies to explain the concepts, and use metaphorical language, and even give a lot of demonstrations. But I'm not incredibly mathematically sophisticated, but it's a lifelong fascination of mine. But I do say that at least people must have a fundamental understanding of those four main pillars of physics: mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics. And I first mentioned it in in the paper in Eternal Echoes, Metaphysical Inquiry into the Fate of the Universe. But I mentioned it much before I even, wrote that thesis. And then I followed up with Axiom of Necessity, in which I talked about, I asked all these questions about the universe, how it began, how it may end. But then I talked about these things that I call the omnifactors, because, I was still, religion was all around me. My dad was Catholic. He read the Bible. I was in these youth groups in South Florida, all these like Baptist churches like Calvary Baptist and Calvary Chapel and things like that. And, I was baptized, and there was youth groups, and I, went all in various different organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and International Church of Christ, and, and so, but then I started to ask questions about what I call the omnifactors. And, omnifactor prime I call omnipresence. And from there you can derive omniscience, which is knowing everything, and omnipotence, having power over everything. And the reason why these things were important to me is because I was, attempted to be victimized, but not by anyone in particular, just by, religious dogma that, dominates the earth. It's a cloud that's over all of us for so long, by religious trauma. But because one of the things is just that, says that God, this all-powerful creator of our existence, is always watching us, is all the time. There's nowhere you can go. There's no secrets you can have. God knows all of your thoughts and everything that you do all the time. It's kind of like Santa Claus, right? He knows when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you're bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. Which is interesting to say that, because that kind of negates, somebody watching you all the time. If Santa Claus knows when you're sleeping, knows when you're awake, knows when you're bad or good, right? That might scare people into being good. But then the last line says, so be good for goodness sake. I mean, that's really what any sane person should do. Just be good. Right from wrong. My mom always used to say that. Right from wrong. So be good for goodness sake. Like, what's bad and good, so be good. Just for the sake of it. Because why would you not want to be good? Like, it's kind of dumb. Right? And so the same thing is with God, Jehovah, Yahweh, Allah, like watching us all the time. It's weird, it's creepy, it's scary. But the God of Abraham, right, from the Abrahamic religions, supposedly possessed the omnifactors. Supposedly was omnipresent, everywhere all the time. And because of that, was omniscient, knows everything, knows when you're sleeping, knows when you're awake, knows when you're bad or good, right? And is omnipotent, so can do stuff about it. Flood the earth. Send you to hell. Or at least not let you in heaven. You burn in an everlasting lake of fire. But a lot of the attributes of this creature just didn't add up with the omnifactors. Specifically, omnifactor prime, which would lead to omniscience, knowing everything, because if you know everything all the time, then why are you letting people sneak around in the garden, your creations, and let a snake talk to them into eating a fruit that gives them, the knowledge of good and evil, which there goes good and evil again. It knows when you've been bad or good. So now they know it, and I mean, it's just weird. And like things like getting mad about them building a tower, or let there be light before the sun was created in Genesis. But when you put a being like that is not infinite, it's not eternal, and the attributes that are given to it don't match up with the behavior. So we have this, and the omnifactors, starting with omnifactor prime, omnipresence, being everywhere all the time, the being just did not fit that bill. It was definitively not that, because it's a being, it's not being itself. Being itself is, like the name of that movie with Michelle Yeoh, is everything, everywhere, all at once. That's like one of the best ways you can say it. And so I came up with, I wrote Axiom of Necessity and said that, we need an axiom to put an end to all of this infinite regress and, what comes before. If there was the Big Bang, what came before that? And then what came before? Like, the whole thing was to put an end to this. And so then I wrote and published the Eternality Axiom, which was based on my understanding of omnifactor prime, omnipresence, and everything, everywhere, all at once. And my Eternality Axiom simply states the omnifactors, but states it in just a slightly different way that, for me, rolled off the tongue quite smoothly, and was also a mnemonic device that helped me to think about it over and over again, until I finally wrote that paper. And it says that the Eternality Axiom stated is all knowledge and all power is in all places at all times, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. That's another great way of saying it. When that movie came out, I was somewhat surprised pleasantly, because I thought to myself, why didn't I think of that? That's such a concise, elegant way to say that. Everything, everywhere, all at once. That's the fundamental nature of reality and consciousness. It's everything, everywhere, all at once. All knowledge and all power is in all places at all times. That's eternality. The fundamental nature of reality is eternality. And it started off with eternal echoes, because, and that was sort of a nod to the cyclic theory of the universe, which there's a lot of things that hint at the universe fundamentally being eternal. And, things like the block theory of the universe, which I even think that Einstein was a part of. And, to close this out here too, if you haven't read the papers, I've read them as audiobooks, so they're on my podcast. You can find the Eternality Axiom as a podcast, and you can also find Eternal Echoes as a podcast, and Axiom of Necessity is even a podcast by itself. They're all standalone. I call them lo-fi audiobook podcasts. But some of the proofs here, and then I wrote a follow-up paper after Eternality Axiom, and I included some other things, as well as I just fluffed it. I not fluffed it out, but I fleshed it out, I should say, with just a little bit more information, but it just supports what I previously wrote and published. And so, from going back to science, right, to physics, we have some logical proofs that support the axiom, the Eternality Axiom, which is an axiom of necessities. And you can first start with good old Einstein once again. And I think that this is actually going to be a good way to bridge quantum mechanics and general relativity, is this understanding where the Eternality Axiom comes from. And when we look at Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, which we have validation for what it stands for, which is the interconvertibility of energy and matter, represented as a certain measurement of matter being mass in the equation. So E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light times the speed of light, or E equals mc squared. E, of course, being energy, the m being mass, which I said is a measurement, a specific measurement of matter, and the c is the constant of light, being a very fixed speed, multiplied by itself. So it's a wonderfully large number. And that's how much energy you can get from matter. And the atomic bomb shows us that, as well as, particle accelerators. That we can get matter from energy and energy from matter. They're interconvertible. Now, what's even more fascinating about that is, if we go to the first part of the equation, E, the first law of thermodynamics discusses this in great detail, and the first law of thermodynamics shows that energy is conserved. And conservation laws tell us things like this, that we hear about in popular culture. We hear all the time, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form. And the fascinating thing about that is, right, if energy equals mass, a measurement of matter, times the speed of light squared, then wouldn't it be interesting if matter was also conserved? Well, gosh darn it, physics tells us that it is. That matter is also conserved. That matter is not created or destroyed. It simply changes form. We only usually hear about energy in that way. But matter is also conserved. And energy and matter are equal to each other. You can get one from the other. They're interconvertible, meaning you can convert energy to matter and matter to energy. But the fundamental thing that really, helped me to seal the deal with the logical proof. And remember, I'm not talking about an empirical proof, meaning we don't have any way to directly test eternality. Just like we don't have any way to directly test the aforementioned string theory that I'm so fascinated with. Just like Sheldon Glashow said, is it a theory of physics or philosophy? I ask you. Because although string theory and my eternality axiom are grounded in mathematical formalisms and established laws of physics, you can't prove it. And that's the thing here, is that when we look at conservation of matter and energy, we're looking at something that is functionally identical to eternality, being eternal, which is, if something cannot be created, it means it always was there. And the thing itself is here now. And if it cannot be destroyed but just change forms, it means it always will be, just in either that form or another. So conservation laws, conservation of energy and matter, are telling us that energy and matter are essentially, not just essentially, but they are indeed eternal. That's the logical proof. And if energy and matter are the fundamental constituents of our reality, right? We got matter, energy, space, and time. Matter and energy exist in space and follow an arrow of time towards entropy, right? Things dissipating into heat death, like the second law of thermodynamics, the inefficiency of interactions and how they just eventually just get dissipated as heat. And so, but that's the basis of the Eternality Axiom, that at first metaphysically questioned the origin and the fate of the universe in eternal echoes, and then realized that the universe must in fact be eternal somehow. It really is why I even indicated calling it eternal. And then thinking about the omnifactors, realized that I must of necessity develop an axiom, and therefore the Eternality Axiom came forth and was explicated using established laws of physics. And then another thing, just to geek out finally here, which is just a little addendum, well, not an addendum, but just a little add-on here, because I've already clearly made my point about the fundamental nature of reality being eternal. And remember, I started off saying that there are many different reasons for doing things. And the reason I was really getting at was why it took me 16 years to finish my doctorate, when it could have taken me easily for a program that you can do all online, right? Nobody goes to a campus. Nobody goes to that Arcata house in California, which is the campus, technically, of the University of Metaphysical Sciences. It's all an online, self-paced program. And people finish it in a year and a half, 2 years, on average. I think that's what I read in some of the materials, that it would take about 2 years for somebody to finish that. And I took 16. And the reasons are because I was deeply conflicted. It's one of the reasons. Conflicted, right? And so I went through all of these different phases until I finally finished that up. And then, one of the things I proposed, which I wish I could figure out who it was that I learned had said that as well, because I'm not the first one, but I do know that I heard the idea first about Fourier transforms from the folks who call themselves ontological mathematicians. So there's this field called ontological mathematics, which I first heard about from a guy who's pretty wacky but is interesting, named Morg, who claims to be, get his information from ontological mathematics, and he calls himself a Hyperion. He started his own kind of movement or whatever. And then, I was also fascinated by the work of Paul A. Laviolette, which subquantum kinetics is something people should really look into. And he's got this a new theory of ether, with these etheron interactions through model G and things like that, about how various different fluctuations in the etheron field give rise to the fundamental particles, which is the same thing about the perturbations in the quantum field, or in the 0 point, or in the string field. They all are pointing to the same exact thing, that various different fluctuations, perturbations, or permutations of the way information is related to itself and each other in this, what we would consider to be a non-physical field before we get particles. They're all the same thing in the quantum field as it is in the string field, as it is in the etheron field from subquantum kinetics, and so on and so on. And it's the same thing with ontological mathematics. They talk about sine and cosine waves. And the one thing that I wrote about in Eternality Axiom, and then later in the follow-up paper, was that it's possible that the way that matter gets converted to energy and energy converted back to matter we can look at it, model it, and map that using the Fourier transform, which is basically signal transduction, or how signals, first of all, we have how we break apart frequencies into its constituent parts, and they're sine and cosine waves. And interesting enough, there's standing waves, which are perfect circle, not perfect circles, but they're closed cycles. Some can be, a perfect circle, but that's not a standing wave. Standing wave just means that it's a closed loop, and there's closed strings in string theory, and then there are traveling waves, which could be like open strings in string theory. I'm the one saying that. I'm not saying that this is what string theory says. I'm just mapping these things onto each other and playing around with the idea, conducting thought experiments. But I propose that the way that, because we don't see it, that matter gets converted to energy, and energy gets converted to matter, and matter to energy, are through inverse Fourier transforms and Fourier transforms. So an inverse Fourier transform would be used to take what we consider to be a clear signal of, like a photon, for example, or an electron, and then using an inverse Fourier transform, we would break it down into its constituent parts, and then that would be in what we consider to be the non-physical realm. And then use a Fourier transform to take those signals, put them back together, and reconstruct them into what we see as physical reality. And I'm proposing the same thing is happening, which is what is described by Model G. I wonder what would happen if we looked at Model G from subquantum kinetics, Fourier transforms, and inverse Fourier transforms, and see how those fluctuations and also the things that come from the string field and from the 0 point and the quantum field, and see how they actually would match up. I'm pretty sure we could find some pretty significant matching there that would possibly, I don't know, I would like to think it would, it would be nice. Maybe that's the emotional part of my brain thinking, if some breakthrough could happen from looking at these things all together rather than being so disparate. A lot of things don't get done because of a sort of macro version of competitive inhibition, which you find with, like, for example, enzymes in the body. And so, another note to think about is that, an inverse Fourier transform takes, for example, let's take matter, for example, and it would break it down, because matter is in the time domain. Remember, we have matter, energy, space, and time. So matter is in the time domain when we're talking about Fourier transform, right? It's like a note that we hear, and it's or a solid particle, right? Or what looks like a solid particle, like I said, like a photon or an electron, and any other fundamental particle like a neutrino. And it's in the time domain, matter and time. And then inverse Fourier transform breaks it down into the frequency domain, which I don't know if it directly maps onto space, but I'm just kind of arbitrarily looking at it like that. But the frequency domain is what we consider to be non-physical. And in order to get that from what's closer to energy and space back into time and matter is using a Fourier transform. So I'm just looking at that as one kind of model of how to move these things back and forth through space, time, matter, and energy. And I'm going to have to think about this some more. It'd be interesting now that I've started talking about this, but if those things actually kind of do map over each other. So all of that, because it took me a long time to do a PhD in a school that is, off the beaten path, one that I'm really glad that I went to. After the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, I graduated from in 2006, enrolled in the University of Metaphysical Sciences in 2008, and finally got my PhD in 2024, and have been using my understanding of both of those things to develop what I'm calling the Institute of Metaphysical Hypnosis, which is also a funny little kind of Wario Mario play on the initials of the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, which is HMI. My Institute of Metaphysical Hypnosis is IMH. So I'm really vested in making this happen, because I think I'm sometimes a clever man by coming up with all my little initials and acronyms and things like that. So it's interesting. I mean, this is, one of the things that I love doing. My version of metaphysics is a combination of science, spirituality, and philosophy. And my other great love is the writing of and singing lyrics, composing music, and playing and recording instruments, and making songs and publishing them. And then, of course, practicing martial arts. So those are my 3 M's: metaphysics, music, and martial arts. I can't do without them, but they're all related to me. They're all one, and they all fall under my category of healthy living and self-defense. They converge. After many years, I didn't realize. I thought they were so disparate and different, but they're really all one and the same, just like we all are. All knowledge and all power is in all places, at all times. I am Hakeem Ali-Bocas Alexander.